Welcome to the Growth Hacking Culture Podcast, the show that dives into the complex world of work and leadership. Today, we are tackling a topic that is often overlooked but has a massive impact on our economy and society: the disability employment gap. The numbers tell a compelling stories. In the United States, for example, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities constantly more than doubled that of people without disabilities. And you will tell me, especially for my Europeans listeners, that this is an American thing. No, it is not. I have also the French data, and I can tell you that it's quite comparable. It's not because the French would believe that they are more empathetic with disabilities. No ways. A 2023 report from the Bureau of Labor of Statistics in the USA, is easier to find USA statistics, by the way, show that only 22% of people with disabilities were employed compared to 66% of people without disabilities. That's a big number. Today, we are going to explore what companies are getting wrong in their approach to disability and how a more intentional, inclusive strategy can benefit everyone. We are going to be joined by Rachel Shaw, an expert in the field, to help us understand the systemic issues and, most importantly, provide a roadmap for change. So, we are going to get started, but first of all, thank you, Rachel, for spending time with me. I really want to understand a little bit more the problem, and I also want to understand what most of the people are thinking behind, because maybe they have good intentions to help someone with disabilities, but when they think about the money, efforts, energy to be used for that, they say, okay, no ways. The heart, we can park it. Now let's talk real cash.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Thank you, Rachel. So, Rachel, many companies view disability inclusion primarily through the lens of compliance or social good, a feel good initiative. Let's start by going beyond that. What are the most compelling bottom line business benefits like innovation, market growth, and talent retention that companies unlock when they build a robust disability program?
Yeah, great question. Look, industries are going to be very different. Countries are going to have very different realities when it comes to disability compliance. I've worked with companies where they might have 5 requests for an accommodation, and that can be anything from someone who's taking a medical leave because something they have an illness or injury, or someone needs intermittent leave for an injury or illness, or someone is trying to work, but they have a disability where they need support. And there are companies that have very low volume of requests. I work with companies where 40% of their employees, and they have hundreds of thousands of employees, are either have a disability or are requesting an accommodation. And then, of course, there's companies in between. And what we find is that regardless if it's a disability program or not, why employers need to have good employment practices, including disability inclusion programs, is because whether you're disabled or not, you are watching your employer to see how they are going to treat either you or others should you get that need. And most people, if they stay at an employer more than 5 years, they're going to have some need for either a short-term leave or a family leave. And you're looking to see what your employer might do for you. And so what we know is when employers have good process and programming, when they say to an employee, look, you have a disability, we're going to treat you similarly to than your neighbor or your colleague down the hall. When they take away what often gets brought into disability programming, bias, preference, opinions, all of those things taint programming. And what happens is when employees see that, they feel less we talk a lot in business now about psychological safety, right? They feel that they're higher risk. They don't see that they're going to be treated fairly or equally. They see a supervisor opinion based decision making model. And so what an employer can do when they tell employees and show employees through having good either disability programming, whether it's grievance programming, whether it's promotion programming, what they tell employees is you're going to be given a fair shot. We're going to use data to make decisions, and you're going to be safe. And when employees feel that they work for an employer who's going to give them a fair shot, who sees them as important enough to try to accommodate or try to support, they are going to stay longer. They're going to be more productive. They're going to be willing to bring their innovation, their ideas. And what we know is that diverse C-suites, diverse CEOs create 20% more profitable companies. We know that employees who feel that they are working in a diverse workplace, whether that's disability diversity or simply seeing themselves in managers and supervisors and C-suites, we know that they stay longer because they see a potential roadmap, either consciously or subconsciously. And so that's what employers are going to do. You're going to create a more stable and a more effective and a more profitable workplace. I would love to change everyone's hearts and minds, but the reason that disability inclusion, that diversity inclusion is important because it makes companies money. It really is about the bottom line.
Do we have real data that shows that let's divide the world of work in two parts? So we have the white collars, people in the office,
Mhm.
and we have the blue collars. Do
Yeah.
we have data to show that in one of the sides we have outcomes, money outcomes, productivity outcomes from the use of the implementation of a disability program?
The reality is, and the sad truth is the people that are most harmed by a lack of having a disability program, or the people that are most harmed when they get a disability, is always our lower wage earners.
Hmm.
You are, you work fully remote. You have a flexible schedule. You might be on salary. You have so much more ability to self-accommodate. You may never ask your employer or need your employer. And so what we see when you reference those numbers of under 25% of a disabled population being employed, it is primarily people that have to show up for a job where there's a physical component, a grocery store, a truck driver, someone who might be working in a warehouse, people, a custodian, a school teacher, people that have to physically show up and perform work. Typically, that environment, even if their disability is psychological, that environment is more difficult for a lot of reasons for employers to accommodate. And so we don't have a lot of data, but I can tell you what we do know is that in my line of work, and we support thousands of employers, primarily in the United States, about 90% of all requests for accommodation come from the lower half of the pay scale in an organization. The people that need the jobs the most and have the least flexibility in their jobs. And you have employers who their nature is not always wanting to be flexible. They want employees that can do the box of the job. And they don't want to be looking at that flexibility, or it's harder for them. And that's my job, is to help workplaces get more creative, think about work more flexibly than that box that's on the job description.
I love this word, to force employers to become more creative. And you are right.
Yes.
Today, I was mentioning that I live in Switzerland, for instance, somebody with disability. If the workplace cannot accommodate this person, then it will go into the payment of the government paying social stipend to so that this person doesn't because cannot find a job, which is a
Yeah.
cost for the society. Instead of
Yes.
finding a creative arrangement for this person to be in the workplace,
Yeah.
people with pain in the back, people with that needs a little bit of a follow up from time to time at work. So there is a preference to leave it to the government, but in fact government and the workplace could work together to find this creativity. And I
Yeah.
have never heard a consultant for people with disability in Switzerland. Never.
Yeah. Yeah. Part of the reason is because in America, where I don't think it's wrong to say that there is often a higher percentage because there's just not the safety net. And so what the government did in 1990 when we passed laws in the United States, the laws were passed really with the focus of forcing employers to work harder to keep people with disabilities employed.
Yeah.
So that the social network, which is it's weak and was overburdened, it also just doesn't. I mean, it's not even sustenance living if you're on disability. And so what we found was that there's this real legal push, right? This compliance push where there's much more power for individuals with disabilities in some countries because they can actually sue. And that is why people like us exist, because employers don't want to be sued. And it's very expensive and it impacts their brand. And there's also a lack of workforce. There's just not enough employees often to fill those jobs. But a lot of times we get brought in for that compliance piece that you mentioned in your first question, as opposed to the culture piece. And our job as consultants is to be independent and to force the culture conversation, to do it for the right reasons, which is profitability, which is, your culture, which is the right human thing to do, but to also make sure you're doing it right so you don't get sued.
Hmm. I have the impression that when companies or even individuals have to do something because of compliance, we always find a way of cheating, a way
Yeah.
around. I have been discussing about the same topic, for instance, with organizations who are in sustainability. So when it is about compliance, they will find a way around to ditch it, to do what they have to do, and just check the box in a way that is doesn't bring anything, any positive impact for the society or or the planet. And I guess similarly in disability, if it is because of compliance and not because of the culture, because we think that this is the right thing to do, then people will it's going to be cheating.
Yeah. I think there are people at the top of organizations. I think there's a lot of people in organizations that care deeply about supporting employees to work, whether they have disabilities or whether we're hiring in other diversity goals. I do believe, but I will say that generally the biggest impact that I see is you have the top of the organization who clearly wants to have the right culture, the right for to support their brand, to ensure that there's not litigation and legal issues, but also to make sure that they are promoting themselves in a way to the consumers, right? You have HR teams who care deeply about making sure that we remove unnecessary barriers to have more equality in employment. And you have supervisors that care deeply, but what I see often is if we don't have good programming or processes, we are leaving decisions on who gets hired, who's accommodated, who gets fired to a personality or a preference or a belief system of an individual supervisor. And that is really high risk. And so what we want to do is make sure that we're not leaving these high, because, someone with a disability that's not accommodated, that has a ripple effect. That may impact their ability, to be hired somewhere else. And so we really want to make sure they're treated as fairly as possible and that the right criteria is being used if they're not going to be accommodated. And oftentimes the supervisor or manager may not know the laws well enough to be taking the right data into consideration.
Hmm. There is often mentioned a problem that it is the cost of integrating
Mm,
a person with disabilities.
yeah,
And it can be sometimes a little bit tough because we are not talking about the cost of employing the person, but there is also the cost of bringing this person from his home to the workplace that sometimes needs a little bit more of understanding because it's not easy for us taking a train from the village. I was mentioning the famous village of 500 people where I live. I take a train
yes,
to the city. It's going to take me 45 minutes, but it is easy because I can go around the stairs. But if these stairs weren't there and I need to have a wheelchair, of course it's going to be more complicated. It is possible in Switzerland, but you have
yeah.
to increase by 30%, by 20% the path to enter into your office. Is there an average cost in, like, if we take the example of the USA, an average cost of how much it costs to integrate a person
Yeah,
with disability in average,
yeah.
and a return on investment? So do we recover that after some time?
This is very country dependent because in America, they passed a law in 1990 requiring accessibility for buildings. So in America, the average cost of an accommodation is $300, $0 to $300. That is really the range. 0 to 300. What cost employers so much is the cost of attorneys and people like me, to be honest. And I'll tell you an example. This is kind of gets to the core of the issue is oftentimes there are assumptions that are being made by the decision makers. I'll give you one of the most extreme cases I've ever worked on. I worked with a second grade teacher who we'll call her Miss Jolie. Second grade teacher, worked for her employer for 25 years, taught second graders, right? She goes into the hospital a couple days before her winter break is over and wakes up 3 days later and she is a quadruple amputee. She contracted sepsis. They amputated both arms and both legs. She took 1 year to recover. And when she was looking to come back as a second grade teacher, her employer could not think or discover any way to bring her back. They felt that there was no way. They thought they would have to hire someone to support. They thought that it would be nearly impossible to get her back to work. And what we found was when they finally brought me in after attorneys were involved and litigation threats, the only thing this woman was asking for was the ability to bring a three-tiered rolling cart in that she could move. She had her own wheelchair, she had her own technology, and that the school was already accessible. We got her back to work for $69, something she was willing to pay for, but it was a $69 rolling cart that she would help make it easier for her to move around with her wheelchair and her supplies. And what we got back was a teacher, a second grade teacher, and who not only was their best teacher for 25 years, but was able to finish her career as one of their best teachers. And she represented for those second grade students a visual of what is possible. And so the ROI is for $69, hundreds of second graders went through her classroom and they saw the resilience and the ability and the lack of making excuses, because who has a better excuse? This visible representation of what is possible and how we limit ourselves. I mean, those second graders are eventually going to be sitting in a boardroom, employing people, making decisions on who to hire.
Hmm.
And when they see someone who comes in a wheelchair, they're not going to think they're going to cost us money. They're going to miss time for medical appointments. We're going to have to redo our ramps. They're going to think about Miss Jolie, their hero second grade teacher who was awesome. They're not going to see limits. They're going to just remember this positive experience they had. And that is why it's so important that you have representation and employers don't allow their biases and their beliefs and perceptions. And it's not even necessarily that they're bad people, but they're coming in with all this fear of it won't work. I know it won't work. We are not even willing to try because it's so much risk. And if employers are just willing to try, oftentimes employees with disabilities are the most creative. I mean, talk about ROI for $69. They got a teacher back for another 8 years before she chose to retire. And she created more potential, more opportunity for generations to come by simply seeing, without excuses, this person living in the world, right? Unapologetically and thriving. And that's what I think employers often miss is they believe it's going to be expensive, and oftentimes it's zero cost. Sometimes, the data we get from in the United States is $300 or less. In other countries, I mean, I can't help myself when I'm on vacation in other countries. I always think, oh my gosh, it would be hard to be disabled here, because it is not the same. You don't always have ramps. You have cobblestone sidewalks. There are more challenges. But most disability accommodation matters aren't wheelchairs. Most disability accommodation matters are invisible. Psychological disabilities, back injuries, someone who might have internal issues or cardiovascular, or might have vision. And those are often accommodations that can easily be managed within a building that the person works in and can access naturally.
Rachel, you mentioned the case of being disabled in another country. And you made me think of a story that somebody told me when I was in university. There was this guy who was going into wheelchair. He was an engineer, finishing engineering. I met him in university, and he told me about the final trip that his class. He was doing physics. His class went to India, and he told me all the impressions that he had because everybody was looking at him like it was the first time ever they saw somebody disabled. And we know that the proportions of disability is more or less similar in every country. It's just that he was shown in the society, and in certain countries you don't show the disabled person. It is the person that stays at home.
Yes.
Well, there is a psychological price of being disabled and wanting to be at par with the rest of the world, working, having the same accessibility to work, same accessibility for in universities and so on. Is there something that should be done, in fact, because even though it's not like even in developed countries, let's say America, France, Switzerland, it is always like if you are talking with somebody with a disability, let's talk about somebody with palsy syndrome. uh, he might speak in a different manner, and it's bothering that you don't understand everything that he says. And people let it go, and this person is going to be alone. he will not feel belonging just because it's a little bit harder to understand the way this person speaks. So, is there a, an intensity of mental health issues that is higher with people with disabilities, even if we are gentle, like we are accepting, but we are not really friends?
Yeah. I mean, I think the reality is that a lot of people have different personalities that make you're never going to meet everyone on your work group that you may connect with or be friends with. There are disabilities that sometimes do impact communication, relationships, sometimes how people interact, whether or not they're picking up on social cues. The idea behind disability inclusion programs is not that we ever remove expectations or lessen expectations. The idea is simply that if this is the performance standard, this is what needs to happen. And if the person can meet performance standards, if we remove barriers or we allow for, maybe that person is, not necessarily the friendliest or someone that we always will interact with, or maybe they're harder to understand when there's verbal discussion, but their job doesn't require that. The idea is that employers don't get to hire just what is comfortable for them. They don't just get to retain what is easy to manage. At the end of the day, if the person has the skills and abilities, and if they can do the job, they can do it. With the same efficiency and effectiveness as non-disabled people, employers have to be willing to do what they often don't want to do, which is to remove unnecessary barriers. Put in the ramp or modify the community. So if normally I'm a verbal communicator, I'm gonna walk in your office, Ivan, and I'm gonna say, hey, I need this and this. And if
Yeah.
you have a disability where you can't auditorily process, and I have to now email you that direction, that is something that I may not want to do if I am not someone who wants to go in my office and type a quick email. And I may have to, because if I'm willing to do that extra 2 minutes of step, that employee with a disability can meet the performance, attendance, and safety standards of that job. And that's the goal of the law, is to force employers to retain talent, even if they are not sorting for or preferring that the package that talent comes in. And that really is the right thing, because we are getting, I do believe, especially in certain countries, we have removed a lot of the stigma. We have an expectation or a need to have this portion of our population in the workplace. One, because they can do the work. Two, because we need employees. We have in many countries, we have a shortage of qualified staff. But also, there isn't that same safety net in a lot of countries where you can actually survive and not be employed. And so there is a need for that level of that population to be employed, and a right that they have. So different countries are in different phases of that happening and setting different expectations. But that is definitely something that, even though we have a lot of statistics in America, I would say there's a lot of natural accommodations and understanding of accommodations, especially in the non-physical disability space, the neurodivergent space, the psychological space, where there's a large expectation that we do have to modify how we communicate, how we do work, if that means that person can have an employment opportunity.
You mentioned neurodivergence. The
Mhm.
rate of neurodivergence in Generation Z and the new
Yeah.
generations that are going to work is kind of increasing. I don't know if it's really increasing or it is that before we weren't measuring, but I have the impression that it's increasing because of the digital use of or misuse of digital. Now, how can we help organizations to remove biases like the ones, no, this person is not capable of doing that. No, we cannot accommodate that. Is there a framework to use, an approach to use in order that we see possibilities instead of
Yeah.
seeing just the hurdles that is the painful exercise that we need to go through and it's going to cost us and blah, blah, blah? Is there
Yeah.
a way to do that?
Yes. So what I will say is, especially there are absolutely more people who are seeking employment who identify as neurodivergent, who are self-identifying as neurodivergent. And I think it's very possible that part of that can be technology, it can be a lot of other things. The other part of it I think that is important to acknowledge is one of the main reasons we are seeing, at least in the United States, more people applying for and coming into the workplace who are either on the spectrum or might be diagnosed with autism or other neurodivergency is because they had an educational system that mainstreamed them, that didn't put them on the side and say you're unemployable, who taught them skills and abilities and taught them methods to manage in this world that is this way and that they might be this way. And they taught them how they can. So I will say we are seeing, I think part of the good part of that is education is seeing that just because your brain may process information differently doesn't mean that you are less than. So yes, there is a wide range of what we see, but I think there will come a point when we will see some neurodivergency as kind of a superpower, an ability to lock in and really perform at a high level, but they may have different social skills than what is currently considered the norm or even comfortable. And so I will just say that. But the bottom line is what employers need to do is they cannot leave decisions of whether or not an individual is hired or accommodated with a disability that is known. They cannot leave that up to an individual supervisor because that individual supervisor is not going to have the knowledge and the ability to really see past their own belief system. I'll give you an example. This just happened last week and so it just popped into my brain as you were asking me that question. I have an employer. So think of like a Lyft or a Uber. I don't know if you have in Zurich. I don't know if you have that in your small town, but Lyft or Uber, a ride share. So this is an organization that does a ride share type of thing, but it's for elderly people who can't drive anymore or people with disabilities who can't drive. And they dispatch, they pick them up, and then they take them to a doctor's appointment or the grocery store. So that's the business. So it's not Lyft and Uber, it's a smaller and less technologically savvy company. But this company, the manager found out that one of their drivers was deaf. They could hear sound, but they couldn't discern language. ASL proficient, American Sign Language proficient, and the reason they found out is because the dispatcher assigned to this guy found out on the first day they worked together that she couldn't call him, which is what they would do. So instead, she would text him his next pickup. And she then left the company, and the new dispatcher freaked out when she realized, I can't just call him. I want to be able to call him, and I can't because he's deaf. The manager immediately took him off work. And their belief system, because they had never had this situation before, their belief system was if you are deaf, you are unsafe to drive in a rideshare environment. This employer did not Google. They did not chat GPT. They clearly had never been in a Lyft or Uber like I have with a deaf driver where it tells you on the app and it has information on communication. This man sat off work for 3 months burning his own time, unpaid. And then they brought me in. And the first thing I did to this employer was educate them that there's nothing, they legally thought he couldn't drive. And that is what we have to and he got right back to work. There was no issue. Modifying the communication from a phone call to a text message, there's no burden in that. There's no hardship in that. But the employer saw him as less than, as unsafe. And the data they chose to use, they chose to ignore the data that he had been there 18 months, that he had never had an accident, that he had a commercial driver's license, and that he was well liked by his passengers. They ignored that data, and instead they sorted for, I fear that he won't hear if there's an ambulance and pull over. I fear that he won't be able to communicate with passengers and they're not going to be happy. We're worried that you can't safely operate a vehicle when you can't hear. And they use that, and that is what happens more than we should ever admit, that employers use uneducated beliefs to impact someone's employment. Now, thankfully, it was a zero cost solution, except for they had to pay their attorneys, they had to pay me, and they had to pay him back pay because they inappropriately took him off work. He did not sue them. Had he sued them in the country he could have sued them in, he probably would have gotten millions of dollars. But he didn't. He just wanted to work. But that's why it is so important that the solution employers need to do is that the minute a manager, supervisor hears or is told, I have a disability, I need a medical accommodation, I have something going on medically, they need to pause and they need to get it to human resources or personnel so that people who are trained to be curious to Google to say, I don't know the answer, but let me check. Those people are in charge of guiding the organization to the right answer.
Hmm. The key word that you have used is education, and I think that this is the beginning of a journey for a cultural change so that people gets involved. And that includes me. In fact, only maybe 5 years ago, I didn't know anything about HDHD until somebody close to me had it. Or some other mental health issues that people are having currently. Only when it happens close to you, you start Googling, asking ChatGPT or Gemini or whatsoever what it
Yeah,
is. But and usually we don't pay attention around us
yeah,
because you just need to go one level down in the people that you know in order to find somebody with a disability.
right.
And that is quite easy. But education, this part of education, is that something that needs to be a default? Not when people needs to comply with actually having somebody with disabilities inside of the workplace, but by default we should have, or at least as we cannot cover all disabilities, at least to know why we should care. Whenever we hear a word that we have never heard before, just Google it and understand and ask yourself what would you do in that in front of a person with disabilities.
Yeah. Education is everything, but I think there's different levels of education within an organization that they need. Supervisors and managers, if they're not in HR, their job is not to be disability experts. We can't ask that of them. They have something else they've been hired to be an expert in, but they need to know and they need to have a very base level training, which is whatever organizational rules you have, whatever country rules or state, depending on where you are, they need to have a base understanding that when someone is indicating they have a protected class or a disability, and they're indicating that that is the reason that they're not meeting that supervisor's attendance, performance, or safety standards. That supervisor simply needs to know this needs to go to someone whose job it is to be fully educated.
Mm,
No one, I mean, the reason I exist is because nobody can know everything, and I don't even know everything.
mm,
But most employers don't have dedicated ADA people. Very, very large employers might have large ADA groups, but they don't work on every type of situation. I mean, I have clients that'll call me because they've never had a blind driver, for example, or electromagnetic sensitivity disorder. They've never had someone who is going through in vitro and they want help and they need it. And the idea is that HR understands that they're going to use a standard process. Number one, they're going to understand what the job requires of that person, disabled or not. Number two, they're going to make sure they're using data, information about that person's limitations, not perceptions, beliefs, things that we make up, right? Deaf people can't drive, right? That's what they made up. And this unknowledgeable supervisor, not a bad person, ignorant in that area, but they thought they were keeping everyone safe. And instead, HR needs to have a process that focuses on the job requirements, focuses on the person's actual functional limitations, not what we make up about it. And then they need to have a process where they compare that data and curiously and with a willingness to use Gemini or ChatGPT or Google, right? To look for answers because most problems have been solved somewhere at least once. And most employers are figuring it out for the first time. The danger comes when we have teams, HR teams, who think they already know the answer, so they're not going to need to go seek out more options. And that is the key is making sure that our groups are properly educated, and that education includes some standard processes so that employees can feel safe that whether they have a disability or they're watching their coworker with one maneuver the situation, that they are going to be treated consistently and that data is going to win out over whether or not their supervisor likes them, values them, or feels that this would be an easy or a difficult thing to do for them. So
mm.
that's really the key.
Do we need any specific approach or education? Let's call it education for talent reviews, because
Great
yes,
question.
most of the people believes
Yeah,
that everybody should be judged in the same way, but
yeah,
we already suck at judging people without disabilities.
It's
because we are
true.
biased and we think, no, this person cannot make the job because it was like this.
Yeah.
So should we have a specific education for dealing to, for assessing, not judging, assessing somebody at work?
Yeah. I mean, you said it perfect. We already have a lot of issues because just in general, from hiring, evaluation, and separation, there is so much room for an individual supervisor's beliefs and bias to kind of get involved. What I always tell employers is it's the same standard that I talked about earlier. A supervisor should treat all employees similarly. They should have the same expectations on performance, attendance, and safety, unless the employee says, the reason I am failing to meet your expectations is disability goes to HR. You don't like women, goes to HR. You don't like short people, goes to HR. I'm 6'2", so it wouldn't be me. But, if there's ever a time when a supervisor is treating everyone similarly, same expectations for performance, attendance, and safety, and if that employee is telling the supervisor that is not appropriate, they need to pause and bring in HR. And then HR's job is to determine, is that employee actually saying my disability is interfering with my ability? Because the goal is not reducing standards. A disabled person doesn't have the right to produce less. But the tools aren't going to work. When you are failing to perform based on you just don't know how to do the job. What do? We coach you, we retrain you, we tell you to fix it or else we're going to discipline you. That will work if your issue is a lack of knowledge or a lack of interest in doing a good job. If the reason this person is not doing their job well is because of diabetes or lupus or cancer, you can't cure that with a coaching plan. And so the idea is that we want to be efficient. We don't want to fire people. Performance evaluations isn't about firing people. They're about clarifying the expectations so that all staff can meet it. And if they can't, then we manage them and either manage, support them, or separate them. And so if someone's disability is the reason they're not meeting performance standards, what we want to do is use the right tool, whether that's called a reasonable accommodation or an accommodation, and we need to try. Now, if that accommodation still doesn't work and that employee still is struggling to meet performance standards, but not because they don't want to, but because of a disability, they're probably going to be separated. If in the United States we would look for other jobs, but the reality is they're probably going to be medically separated or terminated, but not because of cause, not because they're a bad person, but because their disability couldn't be mitigated or overcome. So I always say all roads lead to performance standards, but how you get the person there, that is the difference. And supervisors need to be trained that when they're hearing, even if they don't believe it, they think that she's just, what excuse is she going to use today? Great, her grandma died 6 times. Now she's got a disability, even if they don't believe it. And sometimes people do lie. Not often, but they do sometimes. Get it to HR. Let HR understand the job expectation, figure out if they actually have a disability by working with that employee's healthcare provider, and then comparing those two to see what the right tool is to get that person to perform.
Hmm. I want to go beyond just the obvious financial approach because we have already discussed about the return on investment and the cost of integrating somebody with disabilities at work. But I want to talk about the contributors of this productivity, profitability at work. Uh, do we have any proof that companies with a strong disability programs see measurable impact on metrics like employee engagement, retention rates, maybe safety records? Why not?
What we do, so what we know is that when employees have a culture or an environment, when an organization will respond to and provide accommodations, whether it's leave or whether it is providing workplace accommodations to help them work, we know that we see anywhere from 25% more retention. So we're seeing employees in that whole organization, not just disabled employees. We see retention and we see them staying, which is a huge cost. I mean, replacing talent is a huge cost driver for employers. We also know that when employees are in a culture where they feel that they are going to be responded and respected and they're going to have their needs met whenever possible, we do see a 1.6 driver in profitability. We do see a greater overall success in that organization. We know that diverse businesses are 21% more profitable. And so there is a connection I don't want to overblow the whole retention thing. I think that the culture is the reason people stay more than the individual being accommodated. I think that you can accommodate someone and it can be a very painful experience. And they're not staying because you're some amazing employer. They may be staying because they're afraid their next employer won't give them what they need. But generally, we absolutely know that workplaces where they take care of their employees, where they use data to make decisions, those employees report a higher sense of psychological safety. They have a stronger connection and a stronger a positive emotional connection to their employer. They stay longer. They give them more of themselves. They're more engaged. Right? We don't just want employees showing up. We want them to actually have their brains at work. And we know that they often deliver better customer service and a better customer experience when they actually respect the employer because the employer respects them. And I believe that disability is part of that. Whether that employee needs an accommodation or they're watching how that employer is treating their coworker.
Hmm. I want to ask you a provocative and at the same time personal question, Rachel. Um, and it's regarding burnout.
Mhm.
Should a person with burnout be considered disabled? And the reason is that what I know, what I have seen is that people with burnout, even though they recover, they have is a little bit like being alcoholic. It comes back. Is there is certain patterns that triggers again this brain freeze in front of the computer, and you don't do something for a couple of minutes, and then you recover when you have the good habits that can help you out move forward. But you still have it in you, so it can happen from the suddenly you have that. What is your personal opinion about that?
So there isn't a disability called burnout, but burnout is part of I do this whole thing on the unhappy workforce, right? We're really struggling with an unhappy workforce. You know, I can't speak for every country, but especially United States. And part of that is employees who are disengaged, who feel like they're just one layoff away and they're not respected and they are burned out. They're working more hours, they're on call more, especially we're having a lot of return to office procedures happening in the US where people who used to work remote from COVID on are now being returned. Unhappiness can be a psychological disability. Burnout can be a psychological disability. It would not entitle someone to protections under laws unless they were diagnosed with a psychological disability and unless that disability produced restrictions. But I do think employers need to understand that, especially with the younger part of our workforce. These are statistics that shock me, but I mean, you and I are similarly aged, I believe. But when I was first coming into the workplace, when I was in my 20s, I had no expectation and actually didn't want my supervisor getting involved in whether or not I was psychologically happy, whether or not I was, I would never have talked about if I had had a disability, a mental health disability, I would never have talked about it. This newer generation, we're looking at about 30% of our generation will be under the age of 30 by 2030. Okay. They want and expect supervisors to recognize when they are unhappy and they're struggling. They want support through either what are called employee assistance programs or therapeutic supportive systems. They want that mental health support built in and baked into their employment experience. That is very different. And when you have baby boomers and millennial and Gen Xers running the show, and you've got, your Gen Zers and your alphas who are wanting really someone to recognize when they're having a tough day and give them solutions or support or flexibility. It is an interesting time. And I do think that what employers need to be doing is proactively feeding their workplaces what their workplaces want. And it's not necessarily snacks in the break room, but I do think it's flexibility when it's possible. I think for some careers, it's hybrid. I think for some places, it's making sure that employees have respected time off. When they're on vacation, you're not expecting email checks and you're not expecting calls. I think employers need to figure out how do they take care of the physical, but also the psychological expectations of an employee. And it's easier for some workplaces to acknowledge that that should be their problem, and it's harder for others. And but I think that if you don't address what we're being told, 60% of 67% of employees under the age of 30 expect their supervisors to address their mental health struggles, to recognize when they're struggling and give them solutions. That is a statistic that I think should blow us all out of the water. It means we need to have some solutions like an employee assistance program, some mental health breaks during the day, some supportive measures to allow people to actually leave their desk and take a lunch, or if they're working on a line, to make sure that when they take a break, they're not in a non-air conditioned break room, right? These are different things that industry by industry employers are going to have to figure out. But if they don't address burnout and unhappiness, and they don't address I would say mental health, but not necessarily the disability part of it, more of the general unhappiness or struggle or malaise. If they're not going to address that, it's going to either evolve into potentially psychological disabilities requiring accommodation discussions, or you're going to lose your talent.
Hmm, that is true. Rachel, we are almost at the end of this discussion, and it was wonderful to understand all the options and the reason why you exist. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I haven't heard that that exists in Switzerland. Helping organizations to accommodate, to create a culture and move away from this story of just checking the box. I need three people because the government told me so. And making it a culture that is quite wonderful. How can people reach you out, Rachel, if they want to ask you questions? And this is open for people of around the world. I forgot to mention that only 40% of the audience of the Growth Hacking Culture podcast is coming from the USA. The rest is spread in Europe and even in Australia. I saw a couple of guys.
Wonderful. Well, I travel internationally, and this is a benefit. So you can always bring me out. I'll come out to your country. But the best way to get in contact with me is rachelshaw.com. So my name, simple, rachelshaw.com. You can email me, reach out. I'd love to support. The work that I do is to insource this knowledge and ability so that organizations can deliver these services to their employees in-house with compassion and in alignment with their culture, and also making sure that they're compliant.
What a beautiful purpose in life, Rachel. Thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. And it was really, really nice to have this discussion with you.
Thank you. It was wonderful as well. Thank you for having me on this great podcast, Ivan. It's great talking with you.
Thanks.